Welcome back after we did a pretty different kind of episode last week, so I think people are ready to get back into the chronology of things.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about debris and flaperons and barnacology and such.
There's a lot going on here. It's all very interesting. We had left our listeners and viewers at this sort of edge of a cliff where for the first year and a half, basically 15 months of the mystery, there was this expectation that there should be some floating debris. Nothing had been seen from the air. Nothing had washed ashore in Australia. And so the expectation was, well, there should have been something. Where is it? Well, lo and behold, there it is. A piece washes up on La Réunion. This is an island that is owned by France. And so it is under French administration. So now the first piece of wreckage. Now at first, of course, this is in July of 2015. And no one knew if this is what it was. There was a kind of a mystery, but it seemed like this piece of airplane had washed ashore.
Let's talk about exactly what happened. So it's 8:30 a.m. on July 29th, 2015, and on the northeastern shore of La Réunion, sorry, a worker named Johnny Begue. Big? Do you know how to pronounce his name?
I think it's Begue.
Okay. That's my best French. So he did find this unfamiliar looking object at the edge of the surf. It was like kind of rectangular. It was about 6 feet long. It looked like some sort of airplane wing, and it's got all sorts of marine life on it, barnacles and stuff. And presumably he called the La Réunion police, the gendarmes.
La gendarmerie. So yeah, it was kind of bouncing around in the surf. It looked like it had just come ashore, and it was sort of, the way that things kind of bob and float and bang on the rocks. And they picked it up and they put it on the grass. And so the police arrived, photojournalists arrived. And so these images start spreading around the world of the policemen, the gendarmes, flipping it over, looking at it close up. You see these like funny little barnacles on it. And there's a lot of excitement, a lot of, carefully phrased headlines like this might be the first piece of debris. And it took a little while for the experts to say, look, this is definitely a flaperon. It looks like you would expect a flaperon from a 777, specifically from the right-hand side. And there are no other 777s that have gone missing in the Indian Ocean. So really strong suspicion that this is it, that we finally got that missing part.
I'll be honest with you. I did not know what a flaperon was. I know what a flap is. And I know
did
what
not
an aileron is. Oh, you did not know? I mean,
I didn't know what it was. No,
even as a pilot, you didn't know what a flaperon was?
It's not something that exists on something like a Cessna 172, which is the kind of little plane that I fly. Okay. It's something particular to bigger airplanes. As the name implies, it's a kind of a combination of a flap, which is a piece that a pilot would lower on landing. It lets you descend like more slowly and more steeply, if that makes any sense.
Okay.
But it combines the function of that with an aileron, which is a piece that wiggles up and down, and it changes whether you're going to bank right or bank left, and that helps you turn. So it's a kind of a hybrid piece that doesn't really exist on little planes.
It's unmistakably a plane part.
Right.
And you said they believe it was a right wing 777 flaperon.
It came from the right-hand side, and it was more or less intact, but it had the trailing edge, the part that would have stuck furthest out from the wing, had gotten broken off somehow.
Okay.
And so whether that was through like wave action hitting rocks or on impact, if it had come off, there's a lot of speculation. To this day, nobody really knows.
So then after they determined that this indeed was a 777 flaperon, I see that you did one of your several apology pieces. This one was in New York Magazine.
Right. So just so people can appreciate what an epical shift this was in the case, up until this time, a vast sum of money and lots of human effort had been committed to searching the ocean based entirely only on these mathematical calculations derived from data that had never been produced in this way by a plane before, and that arose from an event that nobody could explain. So so to my mind, it was a very, very slender thread. And so the question was like, well, if there's no other confirmation, that seems frankly a little bit suspicious to me.
Yeah.
Especially
So
since, as we said in the previous 2 episodes ago, that I had already figured out that there was a vulnerability by which this data could be compromised.
right, and you'd already written your piece about the spoof, about the
Right,
possibility that it went north, but now
right.
comes your follow-up piece for New York Magazine. I'm just going to read your quote here from it. It
Sure,
says,
sure.
"Back in February, I explained in New York how sophisticated hijackers might have infiltrated the plane's electronic bay in order to spoof the satellite signals and take
Right,
the plane north to Kazakhstan. MH370 wreckage on the shores of Réunion makes such explanations unnecessary."
right.
So that's that.
Right. So I was like, wow, okay. I had kind of put myself out there talking about this possibility that the data might have been spoofed. And I was like, I guess I'm wrong. Oops. So I was a little bit, verklempt, I guess, as we say in
Yeah.
New York. So, you know, everyone was like, okay, Jeff, you were proven wrong. How do you feel?
I'm guessing not great.
I mean, we've talked before about how like I come up with this like realization that this data could have been tampered with. It kind of I sort of went out alone on a limb talking about it. I didn't want it to be my theory. I didn't want to have my ego attached to this idea. But I'm human, and it's like, yeah, it's kind of. I mean, I felt like I was, as I've used in the past, the phraseology, my ass was hanging out the window. I mean,
Yeah.
I had made this statement and I didn't want to look ridiculous. And this kind of felt like, oh, okay. My saying, look, there's no independent confirmation that this data is accurate. Well, now there's independent confirmation.
Well, I remember this both from the Netflix documentary and happening in real time, but a lot of people, or at least some people, were like, this is bogus. This is not,
Right,
the authenticity of this piece is in question.
right.
There were conspiracy theories already floating around. Everyone's skeptical about everything. There's some general fishiness about where the number plate was supposed to have been located. It should have been on the outside of the flaperon. It was missing.
Yeah.
You point out that, well, that could have been a function of the maintenance records kept by Malaysian Airlines.
Well, there was a separate issue about the maintenance records.
Okay.
It was a confusing time, and Andy, we spent a lot of time in the last episode talking about what this case is like,
Yeah.
and we talked about the strangeness of the evidence. But one thing we didn't talk about in terms of what this case is like is it has just been overwhelmed with conspiracy theories, people kind of spouting on social media that like this isn't true, this is like suspicious, like how come you can't explain that there's mangosteens in the cargo hold. There's been there what we've kind of omitted from the previous 17 episodes, which was very much part of the lived experience at the time, was a swamp, a fog of like claims, counterclaims, misinformation, misunderstandings. Some people seemed really bullheaded in their, persisting to talk about things that we knew weren't true. It was a frustrating and confusing time. And so when this Flaperon was found, which was the first independent evidence that backed the idea that the plane was in the southern Indian Ocean. Of course, there was a just chorus of voices calling it into question and saying that it was, a part of a conspiracy and what have you.
Well, indeed, France could have turned this thing over to the Malaysian authorities, but they decided to keep it on their own, for their own, do their own investigation. Given everything we've talked about and about the lack of transparency from Malaysia, I'm not entirely surprised that they decided to keep it and take it to France. They delivered it to the Direction Générale de Armement, which we'll be calling the DGA. That's
Right,
France's weapon development and procurement agency.
right.
I don't know. That sounds actually kind of logical to me, given that I don't know if the Malaysians were super trustworthy at this point. What do you think?
Yeah, the Malaysians had not really proven themselves to be paragons of openness. And the French also have a history of national pride. So they kept it. They didn't really, they weren't exactly paragons of openness either. And as a result, we had these rumors leaking out, and members of the French press were actually kind of contributing to this air of suspicion by saying, "Oh, these investigators have found these things that are hard to explain." And you were talking about there was some uncertainty about the part didn't really match the records, and sure enough, it turned out that there were some holes that had been drilled as part of it. Okay, just to back up one step, when an airplane manufacturer makes a plane, and these planes typically have like 1 million pieces,
Yeah.
give or take, and some of them don't work, or they don't work as well as they're supposed to. So inevitably, you have these things called airworthiness directives, where the manufacturer says to the operator of the aircraft, you need to fix this particular thing. And in the case of this Flaperon, there had been an airworthiness directive that required some changes to be made to the part. Malaysian Airlines did the work, made a record of the work, but then when they compared that paperwork to the piece that was found, it didn't quite match.
Oh.
And the exact details of this, I don't understand. Some people got very excited about it. I personally felt like paperwork doesn't always match what it's supposed to. You know what I mean?
Well, at any rate, so they take this thing to Toulouse, and the investigators like use an endoscopic probe, and they actually did find the serial numbers that match the records kept by the manufacturer in Spain. So,
Right.
yeah, it's a legit piece, right?
I mean, one of the other part, and you sort of briefly alluded to this before, but there was supposed to be like a placard on the outside of the wing that had like the serial number on it, and that was not there. And actually, in the Netflix documentary, Florence Deschangy, the French journalist,
Yeah.
makes a big meal out of this and saying that like it's impossible that this could have come off. How come it came off?
Yeah.
And so much of puzzling through this mystery is about, well, what is just different from what you'd expect, and what is actually suspicious. Personally, I feel like if a piece has been banging around in the ocean enough that half of it's come off, as we said, the trailing edge was all kind of like stripped away. So I don't know, pieces fall off it. I mean, if all of the other evidence is suspicious, then that could be another piece of it, but it's
Well,
ambiguous.
they went down kind of a wormhole in the documentary, or at least I went down a wormhole about how it could have maybe been taken from a scrapyard or something like that. But I sort of feel like finding the serial numbers on the inside are
This stuff
good
on the
enough for
inside,
me.
finding this stuff on the inside definitely, I think, removed any suspicion about the origins of this piece, like several, orders of magnitude down the scale of unlikelihood.
Yeah.
This very much seems like that it came from MH370, because let's say that you wanted to fake it. Let's say that you wanted to make a piece, you wanted to make it seem like it came from MH370, it really didn't. You would have to have your secret agents infiltrate this Aerobus subcontractor in Spain, look at these handwritten records where somebody in hand had written down like what the part was, this sub component that makes up this Flaperon. It's real James Bond stuff.
That
And which
seems
is
like
not to say it's impossible. It's not
no,
impossible.
we're not saying anything's impossible, but that seems like an extra. I mean, that's some intense forgery.
And then the question becomes, well, in the service of what?
Yeah.
In the service to make it think that the plane is in the Southern Ocean, but most people think that anyway. So who would be motivated to falsely think it would be in the Southern Ocean? Like, my gears were turning in my brain. I was like, well, okay. Would it be impossible for the Russians, if they took the plane, to take a part off it and put it in the Southern Ocean, or put it right on the shore of Réunion Island? And the answer was, well, no, that wouldn't be that hard at all. Actually, it'd be pretty simple.
That seems like a much easier way of doing it than faking a piece from some other.
Right, but there's no reason for anybody to make a fake part.
Okay, all right, let's get past that. So let's just assume that's a legit piece, right?
Yeah.
And that gives the investigators some opportunities, right? So now they can do the reverse drift modeling.
So just the mere existence of this Flaperon, now that we've stipulated that it does come from MH370, the mere existence tells us that the plane did go into the Southern Ocean. And now so what else can we learn, or how else can this Flaperon steer us towards solving the mystery? How can it tell us where the plane went in the ocean?
The other part of it is looking at the organisms on the barnacles that have attached themselves to the flaperon, and what kind of species they are, what part of the ocean they live in, and that leads to this August 21st, 2015 French article from Depeche. And now let's do some French, Jeff. I want to see how yours. I'm gonna try it, and I translated it in my head.
Okay.
But there were a couple words that I had a little trouble with.
Okay.
Here we go.
All right, I'm ready.
Taking my glasses
Strapped
off.
in.
Selon un expert aéronautique toulousien qui a requis l'élément de le voyeur n'aurait pas flotté pendant plusieurs mois à la surface de l'eau, mais aurait dérivé, plongé entre 2 heures à quelques mètres de profondeur. How's that?
Entre 2 heures, which means between two. Okay.
Did you like my French?
The gist of all that is that this piece couldn't have floated. It didn't float on the surface. It floated at a depth of several meters.
Yeah, the deux heures thing. They're referring to this two waters.
Between 2 eggs or between 2 hours, but
right.
2 waters.
No. Deux heures. Between 2 waters.
We're gonna get hate mail. We're gonna deservedly get hate mail from French speakers.
You can go. You want to try the French? Let's see how your Duolingo's going.
No, monsieur.
Okay.
Duolingo.
Oddly, for all that international communications I took, I barely had to use my French in real life.
You gotta keep using it.
And when I went to Paris, I'd speak French to them and they'd speak English back to me, so it was very demeaning. But
I actually got back into French because of the Air France 447. A report was issued, it was under the jurisdiction of the French, and a very interesting report was issued in French, and I kind of like plowed through it, half understanding what they were saying, and I was thinking, man, I took all this French in high school, I should use it. It should be usable.
Yeah.
So I kind of brushed on about that, and then it became useful again for MH370. The French have a very good accident investigation agency, and they are, I mean, a lot of the words in aviation are from French because they were the initial this is a whole nother story, but the Wright brothers, having invented the airplane, then kept it secret for 10 years and really left the French to become the premier aviation nation. Anyway, that is neither here nor there. But the
kicker of this quote is the between 2 waters part.
Which is just their way of saying it floated submerged. It was kind of neutrally buoyant. And that really caught my attention because I am a scuba diver. And if you scuba dive, you know how hard it is to maintain neutral buoyancy. You actually, as you breathe in and breathe out, you're constantly like rising and sinking. And if you want to float absolutely neutral, you have to kind of hold your breath, which you're not supposed to do. Pieces of inert, inanimate objects don't float neutrally. It's impossible. You either go up or you go down. So how is this possible? And why did they even remark on it? So I was looking at pictures of the Flaperon, of which many were taken when it was resting on the beach before the gendarmes carted it off. And so you could really see it from every single angle. And there were these barnacles growing on every surface.
First of all, you also have scuba diving skills. I mean, this is like the mystery that it was like your whole life was accumulating for. It was French, It was scuba, it was airplane stuff. But
it's like Slumdog Millionaire. Did you ever see Slumdog Millionaire?
I didn't, but maybe now I should.
It's a guy who wins. He's like a poor guy and everyone makes fun of him because he shouldn't have any education. And he wins this quiz show because they ask him all these obscure things about history and so forth. And he knows all the answers because he's had such a diverse life. And it does feel like, for me, like I had spent time in Russia, I had spent time in Malaysia, I had spent time in Australia, I'd scuba dived in the Indian Ocean before. It's like a lot of the things just kind of weirdly seem to come together.
It's amazing. You had an email from David Griffin. He was an oceanographer with the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization, CISRO. CISRO. He said he was talking about the buoyancy of an inert object. He said it's very hard to build something that will float slightly below the surface.
Right.
That makes sense to me.
Yeah.
he says the probability that an aircraft part does this is minuscule. The only way it can do it is if some of the object breaks the surface. If it does not break the surface at all, it must sink.
Right. Right.
So he's saying it's floating or it's sinking. It's not both.
So, it can float just touching the surface. But that's not what they said. In this report, it said several meters under the surface. So what does that even mean? And so I'm trying to decipher what this means. We're working on like third-hand reports
Yeah.
and trying to understand what this is all about. And again, we spent the whole last episode talking about how even the evidence is weird and mysterious. And this is another example. We didn't include this in the top 5 weirdest things. This is sort of like number 6 or 7, but how did these barnacles come to be living all over this piece, every surface? And this is why I think they made this speculation that it floated several meters under the water, because these barnacles are called Lepus antitifera. There's only about 6 or 7 people in the world who study this on a professional basis. It really has no economic value. The only reason people study it is because it's a nuisance. If you put a buoy in the water, or if you're like sailing across the ocean, these things love to attach to surfaces of things that are floating in the water. I mean, I like to say that like this case involves everything from marine biology to satellite dynamics, and this is the marine biology part. And let me just talk to you a little bit about what these things are like.
Yeah, please.
They are creatures that live in the open ocean, exclusively in the open ocean. And what they do is, in their sort of infant stage, they swim around and do whatever little critters. Plankton. They're plankton. That's the word I'm looking for. They're plankton. They float around and they do what they do. And they probably find little minuscule things to eat. But what they're doing, when they kind of reach the stage where they're ready to take it to the next level, and they look for something floating. And it can be anything. It could be, well, in nature, it would be like a floating log, even some like seaweed. Now in modern times, they'll find like a floating Clorox bottle, or any kind of plastic debris. A lot of the stuff that winds up in the ocean, they'll grow. And I talked to this researcher who told me she'd even seen these little cyprids, they're called, attached to a paper bag. The thing that to know about these creatures is that for them, anything that they can attach to is extremely valuable real estate, because it enables their lifestyle. What their lifestyle is, you attach to something hard, you glue your head to the surface, and then you eventually stick your feet into the water and you catch whatever drifts by. And so they need to find something to attach to. And so if you, there was a lot was learned about these things because there was a tsunami in Japan and it washed a lot of junk out to sea. And this stuff entered the North Pacific Gyre and it wound up coming ashore in the Pacific Northwest and Alaska. And they could see basically how the material had floated through the ocean by what species of barnacle attached, how big they were, like how fast they had grown. And so you're able to really tell a lot about the path that these things have drifted by looking at them, particularly the shells, because their shells are made of this kind of calcium carbonate. And their composition varies depending on how warm the water is. Like different impurities will enter into the sort of matrix of this material at different rates depending on how warm it is. So it's really like a real record. Sometimes scientists will put like an electronic like tag collar on an animal that they're interested in. This is almost like a free natural version of that.
Yeah, it's like a tree ring.
It's like a tree ring, exactly. And so when scientists saw that this piece from MH370 had arrived covered in barnacles, this was kind of an exciting prospect because it told them, oh, there's like all these little data recorders on this thing, essentially, and we can analyze it. But there was another part about it which made Lepus biology really relevant, which is that how do these things attach and where do they live?
Yeah.
But basically, it's not like a seed landing on soil. These things are animals, and they're free living animals at first. And so they'll come to a piece that's floating around and they'll explore it. And they'll walk around it and they'll sniff it out and they'll see what's the best part for me to attach to. And they like to be in a part that's in the shade. So that's like, if there's a part that's on the bottom, they'll attach to that. And if the part is like flipping around, they'll try to find a part that stays in the water the most. And so when I looked at this piece and saw that there was barnacles all over it, that implies that the piece was completely covered in water, right? And that indeed is what the French researchers were puzzled by. They're like, this piece seems like it would be totally submerged because there's barnacles all over it, and the barnacles live in water. And if you get a buoy or something, or sometimes like I went searching around looking for pictures of boats that had gotten overturned and washed ashore. And when you look at pieces of debris that float in a stable way in the water, you can see a line where the lepus will live below the water line. And there's usually like a line of algae, which is where the water kind of comes and goes. And so that didn't happen on this. And also the researchers in Toulouse put it in water to see how it would
Yeah.
float. And it
Yeah.
floated, and we can put up a picture of that too. It floats like quite high. The reason that this was of interest to the researchers was because the other clue that this Flaperon was going to offer them was an opportunity to do something you mentioned briefly earlier, reverse drift modeling.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked in a previous episode about how if you know how currents go, you can make a probabilistic model of how something that I put in the water today, where it will be 6 months from now. And conversely, if I have a piece, I can run a model backwards and generate a probabilistic model of where it was 6 months ago. And so
I'll get even more specific on this,
okay,
and then I'm
okay,
going to need you to break this down for me because
okay.
I'm not sure that this is extremely obvious to people who are hearing this. So
Okay.
maybe you can make it more obvious. So a guy named Pierre Daniel of the organization Mateo France.
Mm-hmm.
He put out this, or he has this quote. He says, "The buoyancy of the piece, such as it was discovered, is rather important. The studies by the DGA hydrodynamic engineering show that under the action of a constant wind following the initial situation, the piece seems able to drift in two positions, with the trailing edge or the leading edge facing the wind. The drift angle has the value of 18 degrees or 32 degrees forward or toward the left, with the speed of the drift equal to 3.29% or 2.76% of the speed of the wind, respectively."
Right.
Maybe you can turn that into
Well, so what he's
common
basically
English.
saying is that if you put the Flaperon in water, see how much it sticks out, and then calculate how much the wind is going to affect its drift, that will give you a very different answer for if you ignore the wind entirely because you're imagining that this thing is floating submerged. So if you're several meters underwater, obviously the wind is not going to be relevant at all. And so they had this piece, and they were tasked with running a reverse drift model, and they couldn't figure out if they should run it for a piece that was floating, sticking out of the water, or a piece that wasn't sticking out of the water. And when they did it, they found that you got two completely different answers. In short, if it floated submerged, as the barnacles suggested, there was no way it could have gotten to Réunion Island in the time frame that it did. If it floated out of the water, then it could do it. It would come from somewhere in the vicinity of the seventh arc. And so you could say, well, this is a mystery. Or you could say, well, then it obviously floated sticking out of the water. And we'll just forget about the fact that the barnacles somehow grew in the air, which we know they don't. So again, this is why I say like the evidence itself has mysteries. There's a curious element to this Flaperon just in the fact that there's barnacles all over it.
In other words, something is not matching up here. And
there's a curious element here that
weird.
doesn't quite, that just sort of raises an element of suspicion. Now, so in order to not be too, coy, I will admit that I've very soon after admitting that I'd been wrong about the Russians taking MH370, I started to wonder if I was really wrong. And like, if we look at the Flaperon really carefully, can we convince ourselves that, yes, obviously this really did float from the seventh arc? And this was a thing that made me think, I mean, I don't think it's dispositive. I think that maybe barnacles just grow in ways that we don't fully understand. And then later I did find pictures of something floating that did sort of seem like the barnacles were growing on a part that was sort of awash, but not really fully dry. So I don't know. I don't think it's dispositive, but it got me to think, okay, well, let's look closely. Let's look more closely at these Lepus antitifera, because as we've touched on a couple of times, there was this other element, which is how old are these barnacles? And
Yeah.
then secondarily to that, what was the temperature of the water that they grew in?
All this is saying that after thousands of simulated drift models, something just doesn't seem right, which makes you think that perhaps.
It raised enough questions in my mind to say, all right, let's take a deeper look. And I have to say that like by this point, almost everybody, and some people had started to think maybe Jeff Wise is right. Maybe maybe it is all a bit thin that we're hanging this whole thing on these satellite signals. Maybe there is a possibility that it was hacked. But then when the Flaperon was discovered, the door closed. I would say that like
Yeah.
99% of anybody who had been with me or had been was sort of spoof curious. At that point, they're like, no. This like the debris is there. It could only be there because it floated there. And I was like, really? Because it seems to me like it actually would not be that hard to put a piece in the ocean. Um, and I was like, okay, so what else? Like, what else might indicate some doubt?
Yeah.
And the answer that I quickly came to was like, well, how old are these barnacles? Because it's easy to imagine someone saying, this is a sort of story that ran through my head. Imagine that like you've stolen this airplane, you got away scot-free. Everyone agrees that the pilot took it into the southern Indian Ocean where the Inmarsat data says it went. You've actually taken it north, and you're sitting pretty in your dacha in the Siberian
Yeah.
woods.
Yeah.
And you're like feeling very proud of yourself. And you start to see that like people are starting to talk about the fact that like it's all very thin, and it would be
Right.
nice if you had a piece that actually confirmed it. And so then you go to your garbage dump where you've got the pieces of this thing, and you take out a flaperon and you send it with your agent down into the ocean, and you tell them to stick it in the ocean for a little while and then have somebody find it in Réunion Island. Now, is that completely, I mean, the whole scenario that I'd proposed previously involving sneaking into the eBay and like figuring out how to like steer the airplane, all this stuff, that was super, super arcane James Bond stuff. Just taking a piece and sticking it in the ocean seemed to me really simple. And I wondered if like maybe they like stuck it on the bottom of a boat for a couple months. Okay, so I said to myself, okay, like what am I going to look at as proof that I'm wrong? Or at least evidence that I'm wrong. And the answer is like, well, if these barnacles are the size of barnacles are after a year and a half, then that would suggest that this thing has been in the water for a year and a half, well before I was raising any questions about it publicly. So that would sort of kind of not completely eliminate the possibility, but make it much less likely. Basically, I started to ask around. I said, what do we know? I dived into literature. As I said, there's not that many people who study these things. I found a woman who lives in Pennsylvania who is a marine biologist professor, and she has thousands of these shells in her garage. And everyone I talked to, everyone I asked said these pieces look like they're a couple months old. And this gets back to the biology of Lepus antitifera, which is that it is an organism that evolved to grab onto pieces like wood,
Yeah.
which degrades and disintegrates in the ocean. So it has a very, very fast life cycle. It grabs onto a piece, it eats as much as it can, grows as quickly as it can, reproduces, and then it's fulfilled its life mission. It will continue to live for like a pretty long time. I don't even know how long. But its mission is to reproduce. And
And
so it will reproduce like in a month.
so my last note, is we're talking
Yeah.
about July 29th, 2015. So that's
Right.
a year and 3 months or so, four
Right.
months after the plane went missing.
So these things have been growing for like 16 months. But when I ask people who study them, they say that it looks like something you'd expect to find after like a month, 2 months, maybe 3 months. I continued to dig around, and I found a boat that was in the paper down in another French island, and it had like broken free in a storm in northwestern Australia and had drifted across not exactly the same route that the Flaperon was believed to have drifted, but sort of the same neck of the woods, generally speaking. And it had barnacles that were like about the same size, but it had only been floating for a couple months. You
Okay.
can get you'll see pieces. Occasionally, these things will wash ashore, and that they're really crazy looking. Like these animals have a long, sort of fleshy stalk and a barnacle, a heart, like a shell at the end,
Yeah.
and they look freaky. They look
They,
like Medusa,
and
basically.
people eat these in Portugal, did you say? Portugal?
There's a species in Portugal that lives on rocks. The ones that float in the open ocean, like if they wash ashore, they'll immediately like die. They don't like being ashore at all. And so and that becomes relevant as future pieces wash up because not very few of them are found with barnacles on them. But that might just be because like crabs and seagulls love to eat these things. So quickly, within I would say like a month of this piece washing ashore, I've gone from sort of publicly admitting that I was wrong to talking to a lot of marine biologists and starting to get this really severe doubt that how do we explain that this piece, which has been floating for a year and 4 months or however you want to call it, has marine life on it that's much younger.
Do you think that it, I mean, we always talk about credibility, but you've had to apologize on a couple different occasions, and then
Yes,
you've had to retract those apologies as you've learned more. Do you think that makes people think that
that I'm crazy or that I'm a
flip-flopping, you're
bad actor.
crazy, that I don't know. I mean, or that you have such a motive that you keep looking for things to prove yourself right and not, I don't know.
No, I think that's a really excellent question. I think that it's human nature to not want to admit that you're wrong, and it's human nature to, having been proven wrong, to just shut up and go away. Um, I don't see it that way, though. I think that science actually depends on people being willing to change their minds, being willing to look at evidence anew. And so that's what I'm trying to do with this podcast with you is to say, let's look at these things. Let's try to divorce our egos from the things that we've said. I mean, yes, credibility is everything. I mean, so much of the problem with this case is that you have people coming out of left field and we don't know who these people are. They're making very grand and often outrageous claims, and there's just no way to assess their credibility. And I've been kind of in the limelight of this case for a long time. And I mean, I have been wrong on multiple occasions, but I think I've been willing to admit that I'm wrong. I'm willing to be convinced, and I'm willing to change my mind. And I think that's actually essential.
Did the MH370 community, the independent group, all those people, like, did they pay any credence to the barnacle stuff, or at this point were they just like, no, we're out, we're done?
I think that anything that doesn't involve being the crash, being in this on the seventh arc in the Southern Ocean is just of no interest. It doesn't exist. It's like your dog doesn't want to watch television. It doesn't care what's on the screen. It's not there.
Okay.
And so I've been kind of left to work through this alone, but as we'll see, I wasn't the only one wondering this stuff, because years later the Australians issued their final report, and there's just a lot of confusion among marine biologists as they can't really, there's nothing. uh, we'll talk about this in more depth when it comes time to talk about the other pieces that washed up, and there ultimately were about 3 dozen. None of the pieces has marine life that's consistent with a drifting from March 2014.
Super weird.
And so it's weird. Is it dispositive? Again, I think that really my assessment is that nothing is really dispositive. Everything sort of tilts the balance one way or the other. There always can be an innocent explanation for everything. And I think at one point, when we get towards the end of this particular journey or this phase of the journey, it would be good to take go run through a list of all the things, all the pieces of evidence that we have, and for each of them, when you compare it to one of the theories, either that it went south or went north, it's either that way because this scenario explains it, or because it just happened to be that way by chance. And so if the plane did go into the southern Indian Ocean, the fact that none of the life forms are the correct age just comes down to happenstance. Like maybe a turtle came along and ate all the lepus off, and then they had to like recolonize it. Or maybe the waters that it drifted through were so poor in nutrients that they weren't able to grow at their normal rate. Something like that. Conversely, if we look at the evidence, the evidence about the flight simulator, which we'll get into more, like that is a piece of evidence that from the northern scenario would have to just be a coincidence. Whereas if you think it went south, that really is it's that way because this theory explains it.
Yeah.
And so for each account, you're weighing each piece and thinking, is this for or is it against? Is it coincidence or is it a result of what occurred?
I cannot believe we're this many episodes into this thing, and we still have so much more to talk about. This thing.
I know it's like a receding goal because the more we talk, the more we realize, oh, there's this and there's this, and people are writing into saying, well, what about this thing?
Yeah, we'll get there. We'll get there.
This guy named Green Dot Aviation has gotten a lot of views of a theory, and they're like, what about that theory? I'm like, okay, maybe we'll do an episode of that too. But listen, jump in, tell us what you think, ask your questions, recommend, and thank you. Thanks for joining us, and thank you, Andy, for another. You work really hard on this, and I appreciate it. So
you work really hard on it too. It's a collaborative effort, and I'm really having a good time with it, Jeff. We'll see you next week for episode 19.